All right, welcome everybody to the very first episode of the Sparks Podcast. I'm your host, Nick Ross, and I'm excited to bring you this first conversation with the multi-talented and all-around great guy, John Huff. John is a writer, he's a blogger, he's a drummer extraordinaire, as well as the host of the John Huff Podcast. He's a man of many talents and hats, and we have a great conversation and get a little bit meta with the podcast about starting a podcast, as well as John shares his journey from being a writer and this intuitive shift into music. We discuss his motto, how great things happen when you put yourself out there, facing fears, dealing with attachment and the ego and spirituality, and listening to the nudge that the universe gives you, and so much more. Be sure to check out the show notes where I'll post links to John's work, and I hope you enjoy today's episode. Thanks for watching and listening. Talk about than that. I was going back through your episodes and even where to begin. That first episode was a hell of an episode with Phoenix Fire.
It turned out to be one of the best episodes I've had, and that was completely unexpected to me.
Really?
Oh yeah. I mean, I knew Phoenix Fire as a person, but I had no idea what his story was. Now, this is a guy who has Guinness World Records for letting people staple stuff to him, right? And so we're going to have an interesting conversation just about that. But then he starts getting into his story and why he does that. And wow, mind-blowing stuff. And I had no idea. So I got real lucky with episode 1. It set a very high bar.
Yeah, luck is a weird thing, isn't it? You know, that beginner's luck. I was struck by the same thing. You know, I went into that. I'm aware of Phoenix Fire from seeing him around the area, and I kind of know what he's known for. But to hear his story, really, it just opened up this whole other side that I think was just so valuable and so deep. And it was so great to hear that.
Oh, yeah.
And you did a great job and bringing that out and drawing that out and giving it, like, it's a space, right? You hold a space for someone.
Yeah. I've done a lot of interviews in my life, and so I'm savvy enough to recognize when there's gold being unearthed. But the real skill and the real key to it is to just shut up and let it come out, right? So there are podcasts I listen to where it would be so good if only the host would just shut up. Let the person talk, you know? And if you read, like, I've spent a lot of time looking at and listening to other podcasts, trying to learn, right? And reading through people's comments about them. And it's amazing how often that comment comes up. Shut up. Let the person talk, you know? It's hard to do as a host because it's exciting and you want to get in on these stories, but it's like kind of a discipline that has to be developed, I guess.
I think that's one of the reasons, I guess, I feel like the benefits of having you on as a first guest. You're very good at this. You've done it a lot. You are the first guest. So
I'm not going to give you a Phoenix Fire, man. I'm just going to tell you straight up. I have not got that story.
Well, we'll see. We'll see about that. But one of the reasons that I reached out to you is because, you had a podcast already. I have a first episode, what I thought was going to be the first episode, booked with my friend Justine. And
Justine Chantel.
Shout out to Justine Chantel. So I have one booked with her on Tuesday. And this has been kind of in the works for, maybe 6-7 years now. I've been thinking about, should I do this? Should I not? How is it going to come about? And so I finally booked one with her, and there was just something that kind of, you came to mind. And I thought it would be a cool first episode to talk about starting a podcast while starting a podcast and get your insight into that. And you can kind of, already you're dropping the advice on me, right? Is to just shut up. So
it's so meta. Starting a podcast by having a conversation about starting a podcast. I had the same trajectory, by the way. So I launched my show in 2019, and it was years in the making. Like, I thought about it literally for years. Should I do a podcast or should I not do a podcast? And there were reasons why I didn't. primarily it was the tech side. It's like, you're coming from like an MIA background. You understand sound. You understand how to make this work sonically, where I didn't. And so there was a really steep tech curve for me that it was like, I don't know if I want to climb that. It's going to be really, really tough to do. And so I kicked this around for a long time. And then I have been a blogger in the past, right? So I had a music blog that I ran for a few years, and I recognized how much work was going to go into that. It's like when you begin one of these projects, you begin with great enthusiasm. And then it's cool to have your name and maybe to get a logo together and then start booking the first couple of interviews. And then very quickly you get past that little honeymoon and you're like, well, we're in now. And wow, is this a lot of work? And I've been down that road with different blogs I've had. And I knew if I start this, it's going to be way more work than I even anticipate that it's going to be. And it's like, do I have the strength for that? And so those things kept me from doing a podcast for quite a long time. And then a couple of interesting things happened. I pitched a radio show to our local campus radio station, which was, my music blog was the London Groove Machine. It was focused on the local music scene. And I interviewed a ton of people, and I interviewed touring acts, and it was cool. And then I kind of let that go because it just became too much for me. And I thought maybe I can shift this into local radio. We can do a radio thing because there had been a locally focused show that was going off the air. I thought there's an opportunity here to fill that space and to take the LGM concept to radio. Cool. So we pitched that, and I did a pilot episode of that show, and the station loved it and opted not to do it because they wanted student hosts and they wanted the focus to be more on student production. And so fair enough. Okay, that's fine. And so at that point, though, I had begun to get the bug just a little bit to push forward with audio. So that was in the back of my mind to do that. Tried that, thought it was cool. And then in the meantime, I had become a hired gun. All right. I am a drummer. We know each other from the music world. I had been a band guy, and then I began to shift into being a hired player, and opportunities were opening up for me to do that. And so I was suddenly spending time on the road. I was touring. I was playing in Europe. I was doing all these interesting things. And it was life as a hired gun that made me realize I needed my own project. Well, I'll explain. You know what I'm talking about because you're a hired gun yourself. Being a hired gun depends on people to hire you, right? Your life, your creative life becomes at the whim of somebody else, whoever's hiring you. And life as a hired musician, folks, is precarious at best. You can count on nothing, right? So I would go off and I'd do 6 weeks on the road with somebody. I'd come home and there would be utter silence. And it was like, where my next gig's going to come from? The artist would go off and do a bunch of other gigs or do whatever. People lose these positions for a lot of really weird and very unpredictable reasons. And so I found myself repeatedly in what I call the tour come down, which is I've just come off the road, living the life, living the dream, and it looks like it's all going to work out. And then there's no gigs and I'm off the road. And very quickly, depression can creep in on you in those circumstances. And it's like you're making money for a while and then you're not. It's really difficult to deal with mentally. And I realized I needed a project of my own, something that didn't depend on somebody else to hire me, something I couldn't be let go from, something that couldn't go away because the artist decided to not play anymore. Whatever the reasons are that people lose sideman gigs, I needed something that was mine, that I could come home to, that I could focus on and put my creative energy into. And I recommend that, by the way, to every side player that I run across. Whether you have a band that's your own that you write for or whatever. In my case, it was a podcast. Other people do other creative things. But have that And so that was it for me. What really tipped it was I'm coming home and being depressed all the time. I'm struggling to have something to do a lot of the time. So I'm just going to do this. I have the skills. I have the background. I've had this interest for probably a decade. I love podcasts. And so let's do it. Let's jump in. And then so I made that decision. It's a little bit scary and thrilling. Booked my interview with Phoenix Fire, and suddenly the ball was rolling. And that's the basic trajectory of me starting.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was hoping for in this, to get that story, right? Because that podcasting, I'm the same way that I've enjoyed listening to podcasts. I think I've actually come up with a name for this podcast, and it's Great Things Happen When You Put Yourself Out There, because that's what you said in your article. What was it, in 2019? Why now, podcast boy?
Well, you checked in on that, did you?
I did. I did some background. Yeah, I was reading the articles, and I got to say, they're great.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed reading them. I enjoyed going back through the podcast. I listened to Phoenix Fire. I listened to the one with Tanya Thomas.
Oh, yeah.
Which,
the psychic.
The psychic medium. So that one was interesting. And then I listened to Bethany Butzer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so some of those early episodes. Yeah. And then I listened to a couple of the later ones as well.
Yeah. Well, my show has changed dramatically. I mean, it began as an interview show because I've always done interviews. My background is in communications, and as a blogger, I've just really done a lot of interviews. And so when I launched my show, I basically modeled it after Mark Maron's show, WTF with Mark Maron, and a little bit on Rogan. These popular shows that were very conversational. Mm-hmm. I had a goal at the time because, as I said, I was fighting depression from coming off the road. And every time you come home from tour, you think, at least in my case, at my level, you think, am I going to be able to do this again? Am I going to be able to do this anymore because of the money, because of whatever? And so I needed the proof that it was possible, right? I needed the proof that it was possible to live an unconventional life. And so I started interviewing people like Phoenix Fire and musicians like Jason Tate, the drummer of the Weaker Thans, who is one of my favorite drummers ever. As a side note, one of the cool things about having a platform like this is that you do get a chance to spend time with your heroes. So I've been a huge fan of Jason Tate for 20 years, probably close to it. And I got to spend an hour with him at London Music Hall, taping an interview and talking. And I've interviewed loads of other really cool people, all of whom were the proof that it's possible to do the thing you want to do. I needed the proof, and I made it my goal in the early days of the show to share that proof with other people. So that's why it was interviews from the beginning. But it didn't take very long before I began to really think closely about this. And I realized that while I may have modeled my show after Rogan or modeled it after Mark Maron, I don't actually listen to Rogan or Mark Maron. There was some cognitive dissonance there because what I listen to is more or less solo shows. I like a single voice, and that's mostly what I listen to is single voice podcasts, solo shows. And I thought, well, it doesn't add up. I mean, I'm a good interviewer and I have a background doing that, but it's funny if you follow the trajectory of my early episodes, after about 12, which I think was the first Tanya Thomas episode.
Yeah, I think 13, 14, right around there.
Whatever it was.
Yeah.
My introductions began to get longer. Because in the early days, they were very snappy, like 3 sentences and we're into the interview, right? Because who wants to listen to me? And then I started to talk a little more. And I started to talk a little. And then I realized, wait a minute, I actually would like to do the talking. So again, circumstances just led me towards this realization that I like solo podcasts. Why am I not doing a solo podcast? And then it became difficult at times to book guests, or guests would bail on me. And it became frustrating there's a lot of background work that goes into these shows, especially if you're interviewing somebody You talked about having done the legwork on me, looking into my archives. Then you have this process where you're contacting people, trying to book interviews. You're prepping for the interviews that you're about to do. Like there's a ton of legwork that goes on behind the scenes. And it wasn't bearing fruit in some cases. And it was a struggle to make this happen. And so end of 2019 or so, I was like, I got no guest booked. Ideally, you've got episodes in the can ready to just roll out, you know? I didn't. It was a struggle. And the first episode of January 2020, I just did a solo episode just to try it. Because what is there to lose, really, right? And I did that, and it was like starting all over again. So I can't listen to that. I can't listen to the first 20 or 30 solo episodes because the persona wasn't there, the delivery wasn't there, but it became like starting the show all over again. And this is just the weird trajectory that you go on, right? Some people, and I envy them, arrive on the podcasting scene fully formed. There's a show that came out in the past year or so called Big Lash Energy, and that's a Canadian program, and the host is Jana Marie. She's based in Vancouver, and her show arrived fully formed. Her persona, her delivery, her production, really well thought out. Obviously, she put the legwork into prepping how this was going to be, and it just rolled out fully formed.
Wow.
My show and most others roll out and then form over time. So mine went utterly from a complete 180, from primarily guest episodes to primarily solo episodes. Now I'm starting to reintroduce guests a little more. It's kind of, the pendulum is swinging back the other way. And one of the things that I've learned to do is just kind of roll with what the show wants to be. Right?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to say it, roll with the punches. And it does make me wonder about the two versions, right? One being fully formed already going into it. It makes me wonder if it was more of a pivot than a start. Was it shifted off of something? Or did they just come out with an exact idea? I like the idea of it forming over time. I think it allows some flexibility, and I think it's a good life lesson.
It can be. Yeah. Yeah.
You know,
if you approach it that way, sure it can.
Yeah, like perfection is the enemy of progress, right? And for me, I found I was always trying to get everything organized, set everything up. I had a logo, I had all this stuff done. The only thing I didn't do was start.
Was actually do the thing.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I'm also a writer, and this happens all the time where instead of actually writing the thing, you do all the research on the thing. Then you keep doing all the research on the thing. And it's like this avoidance thing, right? And I had it with the podcast, and I've had it with lots of other projects too. There's a certain moment where you just have to plunge in,
You just
a lot of people are, they're more attached to the dream of the dream than the dream itself. You know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely.
It's kind of a weird way to say it, but it's like, as long as you are thinking about doing it, you can't fail at doing it.
Interesting.
So a lot of people,
it doesn't leave you alone.
No, they'll spend their whole life thinking about doing it and laying the groundwork, and when the time is right. And that's a very safe thing to do. You can't fail that way, right? And I've been guilty of that a zillion times in the past too, until I learned to finally just jump in. And it could be messy, and it might not even work. But, it might also blossom into exactly what it's supposed to be. You have to take a certain leap of faith to do that. So I congratulate you, Nick, for taking the leap of faith. And you got a great set. I'm just like in my room here, but your set looks amazing. So good for you.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's been over time. I was thinking about doing for songwriters and musicians too, right? So it's been over time just kind of forming a nice space. And again, probably one of the procrastinators behind me too, right? Setting it all up and getting a nice image behind me. So the writing, I know you've been writing for a long time. When did that start? Have you always written?
Not voluntarily, no. not voluntarily.
When did it
So,
shift from involuntarily to voluntarily?
so at a certain point in my life, I thought that I was going to be a writer. That was going to be my thing. Like I was going to write novels, and I did that. And so I actually am a qualified high school teacher.
Oh, wow.
And there's something I want to ask you, but it'll be off air about
Okay.
your high school experience.
Sure.
And so I left my teacher training deciding that I didn't want to teach, wasn't for me. In my mind, I was going to write books and that was going to be where I was going. And so I started to get serious about it after I graduated school. And I dedicated probably the next 10 years of my life to writing. And I produced some work that never wound up getting published, but I did it. And then I kind of burned out on it. It wasn't working for me. And then I really squeezed whatever creative gift I might have had. I squeezed it really, really tight. And I eventually choked it out.
Right.
So I mean, there's a whole 3-part series on this, the existential part of all of this. I became so wrapped up in being a writer that I lost the ability to actually write. You know what I mean? So
That's
my ego got so wrapped up in being a writer that it forgot the part about actually writing. It's kind of what we were talking about before.
Yeah.
I couldn't fail if I wasn't writing. So, and so I reached a point with that where I was becoming just really frustrated creatively and I was not producing work anymore. And it just blew itself out maybe after a decade of trying. And it was at that point that I stepped back into music. So close to 15 years ago, I just shifted away from writing into music and things opened up and some really great irony followed. So I focused into music and then started playing in bands again and playing around and then being hired and then touring. And then all this stuff ramped up, right? 2017, I went to Europe on tour with an artist called Sarah Smith, who will be very familiar to everybody who's local listening to this program. And I decided along the way to do a tour blog about that experience. So every day I posted a new blog online about whatever happened the day before. And it was a really fun exercise. And it was a writing exercise. I hadn't been writing for years. But it was a way to kind of play around with writing again in a much, much different way. This is not fiction. Some of the stuff was maybe a little, well, we won't say that, but it was not fiction. It was an utterly different style of writing. And so I did that and I produced a month's worth of these blogs and people liked them and I enjoyed doing it. And then Sarah and I decided to publish that as a book.
I remember hearing about that. Yeah. What's the book? You have it on you.
Conveniently, the November, A Month in Europe with Sarah Smith book, I happen to have one on my desk.
Oh, that's
so. The great irony is that I quit writing to go play music, and as a result of playing music, I wrote a book.
Oh, the irony is
that's just a weird sort of twist, right?
That's amazing. So, can we pause and go back for a second? I want to talk about maybe that shift into music.
The music shift, okay.
Yeah. So you were writing. And then there was a shift, and then there was music starting. So how did that shift start to come about?
All right.
Like, did you drum before? Did you?
Yeah. Okay. So the trajectory with music, I was a drummer in high school, did the whole high school thing. And then when I went off to university, I sold my drums eventually to pay tuition in my 4th year. So I was, whatever I was, 21 or something like that. And I sold my kit with the vow that when I paid off my OSAP loan, I would buy drums again. All right. And so for 10 years, a solid decade, I did not play the drums.
Wow.
I was busy going to school and then living in apartments and working jobs and, being a kid in his 20s. Anyways, fast forward, paid off my loans eventually. My wife and I were able to buy a house together before the market went crazy.
Right.
Just the luck of being born when I was. Don't hate me, millennials. Don't hate me. And one of the first things I did was keep that vow, which is I'm going to buy drums when I have the means and the opportunity to do so. And I did. And so I got back into drumming in my early 30s.
Right. Okay.
And I decided I would try to do it properly. So I started taking lessons and doing the drummer thing as a hobby. And I didn't play out for probably 10 years after that. You know, I was jamming with people, and there were attempts at getting bands off the ground that never quite happened. And then all during this time, I'm writing, right? This is me in that period. So I'm focused on writing, not getting anywhere, but I'm working, and I'm playing the drums as a hobby, as I said I would. And so this is where it gets weird, okay? I don't want to weird out your audience.
Get as weird as you want. There's no audience at this point, so that's the benefit. You're setting the bar right now for weirdness, so go ahead.
Justine's going to have a much better time after this, what's coming out of me here. I'm in Jamaica in 2010 or 11, right? Writing has pretty much officially broken me at this point in time. Right? It's just done. I can't squeeze another word out. It's just done. I've wrecked it. And I'm at this resort in Jamaica, and there's a big central buffet where dinner happens and whatever. And then upstairs from the buffet, there's a martini bar. Okay. And so after dinner, my wife and I go up to the martini bar. I'm having like an apple martini. And then a band starts playing down in the main buffet area, just the house band for the resort. And they're playing covers, and they're crushing it, right? They're having a great time, and it's obvious. And they're playing all the songs you know that they're playing.
Of course. Stevie
Wonder, the whole thing, right?
Yeah.
And I had opportunities to play out previous to that, and I had avoided it. All right. I was frightened. It's been years since I played in front of an audience. I had lost a bit of nerve. I was very self-conscious about my playing.
Yeah.
And so I had out of fear, I had avoided taking opportunities to play shows. And so here I am with an apple martini in my hand. I don't remember if it was the first one or not.
First or second, I'm sure.
I don't know. They make them strong down there, man.
1's 3.
The house band is playing. And I had an intuition so vibrant that it was almost audible that said, you have to start playing music now.
Wow.
I mean, I know we're getting weird, but I literally feel as though I heard those words spoken to me.
Right.
You have to start playing music now. And so I went home and I went on to Band Mix, and I put up an ad, and I was like, took this leap of faith. Like, I'm scared to do this. I'm intimidated, but I'm going to do it because that's what I felt like I should do.
Yeah.
Long story short, very quickly after that, 2 guys came over to my house to jam. They were Tyler and Mike, and the 3 of us would go on to form Hiroshima Hearts together.
Oh, wow.
Eventually recruiting whoever we recruited along the way.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden we had this band, and we were in my basement rehearsing for a year. And then it was time to book a show, and it freaked me out. It really did. But we played that show, and then that band took on a trajectory in the local scene, and we did well. And from there, I thought, let's start a music blog, because there wasn't one.
Right.
And at the time, 2014-ish, there wasn't really a lot of local coverage of the scene. And at the time, there was a scene, right? It was vibrant. There were a lot of clubs. There were a lot of bands playing really, really great music. And I thought, there's a gap in the market here, and I have the skills to do this. And so I started writing again there, really.
Right, okay.
Although it was mostly interviews with people, but it's like I created this entity called London Groove Machine as a product of having entered the music scene when I did with that band. And the funny thing is, at a certain point, I got a message that said, hey, you should interview my friend Carly Thomas for your blog. Like, okay, she was a local singer-songwriter doing well, had a record out. So I interviewed Carly and then wound up playing with Carly and then touring with Carly. And then from knowing Carly, I met other people that wound up with me playing with Sarah Smith and touring with Sarah. And it's just really interesting how... Do you ever play that game Minesweeper? Are you too young for Minesweeper?
No, I remember Minesweeper. Yes, I remember that.
On your 486 computer, you used to get one of the stock games was Minesweeper. Yep. It was just a grid of squares.
Yeah, I remember that.
And the idea is you click on the square and hope there isn't a mine behind it that blows you up. But what happens sometimes on Minesweeper is you would click a square and a whole bunch of squares would just open up that were connected to it, right?
Yeah.
That's what happened. My decision to step into music blew open a bunch of squares, like the blog and playing with Carly and then touring and then producing the November book and then all of that producing the podcast to me sitting here with you right now.
Right.
It's this weird Jenga, this weird thing that happened. And the life lessons along the way have been stunning, and some of it's been really, really difficult. But so much stems. When I say good things happen when you put yourself out there, this is my catchphrase.
Yeah.
That's what I'm talking about. You know, you take one simple step into just having a jam with two guys that blossoms into a completely different life than you were having, right? And this is why I say to people and why I commend you for starting this show. Because good things will happen as a product of this. 100% they will. And I say it to everybody. And it's just like, do the thing. Take the chance. There's so much less at stake than you think there is. Whatever your fears are, they're probably 99% inconsequential. Take the step and then watch I've toured in Europe several times. I've toured back and forth across Canada. I've played in the States. I've played on people's records. And I'm not even that good. Like, it just blows up.
Well, I think that could be argued, John. I really appreciate your playing. One thing I will say...
No, I appreciate you.
If I'll jump in there, the Carly Thomas, I think that's actually how I met you, is through Carly Thomas.
Yeah, because you were playing with Hollow Romance, right?
Yeah, I was playing with Leanne, who has a very similar story, which I'll be planning on talking to her soon about that as well.
Great, you should.
Pretty much almost identical to that, not apart from the writing, but just that leap into music, answered an ad for an open mic and then kind of took off from there. So it's interesting to me because I start to wonder, at which point did it start, right? Because for you, it seemed to start at that point of, in Jamaica, you should play again. But all of these other things had to happen before too, like the writing and running out of juice. That seemed as much part of it as turning towards music and then finding out, oh, now I'm writing. I'm doing more writing by getting into music than I was when I was just writing.
Right.
Like, and that's fascinating.
It is. But it's like I had to be instructed to go into music. Like I had to be, I have this sort of this theory, I guess, in my head. It's like, life or the universe will drop clues to you in increasing intensity until eventually it'll just smash you over the head. This happens in relationships. This happens in jobs, whatever. It's like you ignore the signs or you ignore the messages until they become so loud that you can't ignore them. And so for me, it was pretty much a hallucinogenic. It was like something happened to me that was freaky. And
I don't know what was down in those Jamaican martinis there, but who knows?
It's Jamaica. It's the island. People will tell you that the island speaks.
Yeah.
The island speaks to you. And so, it did all, nothing is isolated. It all fits together. But the cool stuff started happening when I started to listen.
Right.
Instead of resisting, right? It's the same thing. Like the tour blog that I did that turned into the November book, that was also an intuition.
Right.
Get a little nudge inside that said, you should tour blog this. Because I've read other people's tour blogs and I loved them.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, for sure.
One of my favorite fiction writers is Douglas Copeland. And I don't know if you're too young for Doug or not.
Yeah,
Doesn't matter. He's brilliant. And I don't know, 20 years ago, he was touring on a book and he was doing a tour blog just every day. Here's what happened on the blog today. And people really love that behind the scenes stuff.
Oh, for sure.
I
Yeah.
sure do.
Yeah.
And so I was captivated by this blog. And I thought this was really a fun thing to do. And then I had read other people. Eric Idle of Monty Python
Right.
was touring, doing live shows, again, like 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And he was blogging it. His blog was hilarious because he's Eric Idle.
Of course.
So this is in the back of my mind. And then this opportunity came along to go do this tour. And it was just the nudge. Do a tour blog. It's like, I didn't have a website. I didn't have a tablet. I didn't have anything. And then, okay, what's the step? All right, get a website together so I can post this thing and then this and then that. And then actually do the work. But it's again, do the thing. Yeah, you have to step into it. And it was intimidating for me because writing had scarred me.
Right.
More accurately, I had scarred myself via writing. I did that to myself by trying to direct everything instead of letting it flow.
Right.
And so I don't know where I was going with all that. The point is I listened to the nudge. I listened to the push that said, do this. And then watch what happens. Right.
Yeah.
And here we
I think
are.
that's exactly what I was trying to tap into with this idea of the Spark podcast, right? That spark. And initially it was more inspirational songwriting, creative wise. And I've been captured by like the national movement of the writers' rounds, right? Where everyone talks about the stories. And I love that so much.
Yeah.
I love to hear how it started. What made you think of that? What happened there, right? And it's fascinating to me that as time went on, I started to think like it's so much bigger than that, right? Like that little spark of that intuitive little nudge, like that's it. That's something. And whatever that is changes the trajectory. Sorry. And it can lead you down a completely different road. And I thought that was a great analogy, the Minesweeper. All of these doors open up.
Yeah.
And so I think I didn't quite know exactly what I was going to get in this first podcast with you. It wasn't even planned on being the first podcast.
Right.
But that's the exact nudge I got was reach out to John.
Oh, interesting.
Reach out to John, right?
Interesting.
And I was like, all right, well, I'll send him a message, right? So that was last Friday or something like that. I sent you a message.
Yeah.
And same kind of thing, intimidating. You do interviews. You've done a podcast. So interviewing an interviewer is, again, a little meta. There's a lot of meta stuff going on here. So we'll get to that, how it feels like to be interviewed after that. But
okay.
And as I looked into you more, as I started listening to more of your podcasts and reading the articles, there was just more and more resonance. There's more and more, oh, that would be awesome to talk about. Oh, that. And there was just more and more. And it's like the reasoning started to come about of why I initially wanted to reach out to you.
Great. Thank you. I'm glad you did.
It's
nice. It's nice to have anybody notice.
Oh, yeah. And about your playing, that was another thing I wanted to comment on was, just seeing you play. I guess the word that comes to mind for me is appropriateness.
Oh, interesting.
So I'm not sure how you'll take that, but for me, whatever you were playing was appropriate to the song, to the stage, to the artist. Very appropriate. That's
what I have learned to do. Drumming's a whole other thing. I've had to come to terms with what I do as a drummer.
Right, okay.
I've had to come to terms with what my strength is and what my philosophy is. And we live in the social media world where I don't know what it's like for guitar players. I suspect it's similar, but in the drumming world, it's just licks. It's like you go to Instagram and it's 15 seconds of some cat chopping out.
Yeah.
So intricately and so technically and so fast that you can't even sort out what he's doing, or she in a lot of cases. And that ain't me. That ain't me, man. But I absorbed a certain, I don't know what it's like for a lot younger people. I absorbed a certain amount of pressure to be that kind of a player. Right?
Like flashy and
technical, flashy, busy.
Yeah.
And I am not that. And I felt bad about that for a long time. I'm not that. Then I realized a couple of things. A, I mostly play with singer-songwriters.
Yeah.
And so if I bust out that 30-second note kick drum fill partway through their little ballad,
Yeah.
I'm fired.
Little Phil Collins drum fill going down.
Right.
Yeah.
It's like appropriateness is the right word because it's like you've got to play what's required for this song. And I'm one of the people who really values simplicity in my playing.
100%.
And the drummers who I follow and am inspired by also play with simplicity. And so it's like sometimes you have to look for the models that make it okay. I'm not self-assured enough to be my own model. I'm beginning to get there, but it's like, oh man, you're supposed to do all this crazy intricate stuff. I better find somebody who's not doing that, but still thriving. For me lately, by the way, that's Charlie Hall of The War on Drugs.
Charlie Hall.
Like maybe my favorite band these days that's not King's X.
Yeah,
The War on Drugs
episode.
Is they're an alt-rock band and they're just fabulous. And their drummer's Charlie Hall. And Charlie plays with such intensity and such simplicity, right? And he's a unique character on the drums. And it's like, Charlie is my model.
Right.
He's playing in front of 50,000 people at whatever festival he's at right now. And it's like, that's what he's doing. And that's why it works. Sometimes you have to get the models that make it okay, you know? And so as a drummer, I've had to really wrestle with what I do well and what people value from me. And what I hear repeatedly is we value that you just lay in the pocket and keep it simple and you sing a little bit for us. And okay, it's taken me a long time to become self-assured with that. You know, everything about me that we're talking about, all of my creative work, such as it is all underscored by this bigger question of self-belief and self-confidence, right? And it's always been a struggle of mine to believe in anything I'm doing, right?
Wow. Okay.
And so all of this is an exercise, though, right? All of this is practice. So I'm reaching a point as a drummer where I'm have a certain amount of confidence in what I do. And the fact that you said appropriateness is actually a real compliment to me because it means that what I'm trying to do is actually happening. It's coming through.
It's being recognized.
That's cool. Thank you.
Yeah. No, I meant it in the best way possible because
I picked that up.
I've played in bands, with talented players, and a lot of people think it's about talent, right? And there's so much more that goes along with just talent and chops. It's also how you work together with other people.
You know, the hang, of course.
That's a big part of it, right? Yeah. But that knowing what the song requires, and knowing what the person requires, knowing what the venue requires, knowing that, I think there's an art form to that, maybe, or I'm interested to hear about maybe how you learned that or how you went about learning that.
Well, partly it was just necessity. Like if the gig required me to be Mike Portnoy, I'm not going out for that gig.
Right.
And then you go through this process where, like, sometimes you learn the hard way. Like, experience really matters. And so when I had less experience, maybe I made mistakes. You know, maybe I made them on stage. Maybe I made them off stage.
Right.
You know, it's the thing is that you've got to be savvy enough to recognize when you're making mistakes, maybe. Right. And not that this was necessarily my trajectory, but like if you find yourself getting dropped by artists a lot, maybe inquire as to why that might be.
Ask for some feedback.
Something, at least stop and think about it, because a lot of people, and I've been guilty of this in the past too, have made it somebody else's fault all the time, right? This artist is not seeing my real value. This artist is a flake, whatever. Sometimes that's true, by the way.
Right.
But a lot of times it isn't, you know? And really, though, for me, I think it's been a game of, again, learning what I do well. At least I think I do well. And then finding the place where that fits.
Right.
So the place where that fits for me is a lot of the times playing with singer-songwriters who are playing Americana, who are playing folk, you know what I mean? Who are playing that kind of folk rock stuff, which Carly plays, which Sarah plays, which almost every. I was in Nimue with Anne Menez.
Yeah, I was going to mention that.
Anne is. There's nobody better than Anne.
Incredible. She's incredible.
And all of these things kind of tie together. So it's like I'm not a speed demon. There are drummers who are speed demons, and they play in the speed demon bands.
Right.
And a lot of the speed demons aren't interested in playing 2 and 4 in an Americana act, whereas I am. And so I find my place, and there's an ego that needs to be curbed there in some cases, and so you learn to do that. I mean, all this is learning, right? All this is lessons. So for me, it was, just recognizing what I do and not just what I do well, but what I like to do.
Right, right.
This is the other side of it, right? Like one of the reasons that I do not have blazing chops is because I'm not all that interested in blazing chops.
Right. What do you know?
So I never developed them, right?
Right.
And so you follow what you're interested, you follow what you like, and then you've got to put yourself out there. You've got to be in the scene, to find your way into the acts that are doing the sort of thing that you feel and that you do well. And it turns out for me that it's that. It's Americana, it's folk rock, it's alt country, which if you had talked to me in the 80s when I was first becoming a drummer, that would have shocked you because I was a straight up glam metal guy. So yeah, double kick, 5 toms, the whole thing.
Doesn't shock me too much. I can imagine that, but
yeah.
I think, there's a level of difficulty which is interesting because it can be difficult to have chops and to be, lay down these licks and these fills and all these really complicated parts, but there's a different difficulty in playing slow, in playing sparse, and sitting in that spot. Some people can't do that.
It takes discipline.
Yeah, and discipline is difficult.
Yeah, but I mean, this is where you develop your savvy as a side player, and you recognize that your game is not to be the show for the most part, right? Your game is to be the platform for the singer to have the show. And so
exactly.
Part of that's just straight up professionalism.
Yeah.
And it can be difficult to lay in the pocket. And if you've got all those chops, it's really difficult to not use them.
Yeah.
And I take the simplicity as far as I can. When I was a kid, I said I had 5 toms and a double kick pedal.
Right.
In a perfect world now, I go out with kick snare and a floor tom, and that's it. So the simplicity even becomes visual. Like it's even the kick that I'm playing on. Part of that's just laziness, frankly. And I'm
not carrying around a 13-piece drum set,
right? And I'm a van tour guy, so space is limited. Yeah. So leave behind everything you can. But I really love the freedom in that. Nothing makes me happier than when I have my little 3-piece setup with a couple of cymbals, right? And it's just like, this feels so nice. And then you play the music, and my whole thing is, as a music listener, as a music player, is the way it feels, right? So for me, playing really well is playing emotively, right? So give me that ballad in 6/8 with the build up into the last chorus, where I can just run that build up with you and hit a cymbal, and it's like you feel this swell. I'll take that over 30-second note chops
100%.
10 times out of 10. But then there are people out there who will play in an act where the 30-second note chops fit and will feel exactly the same thing hitting those chops. Right. And so will the audience.
Yeah.
Right? So everyone's an individual, and you find your way into where your individuality works. And that's great. There's room for everybody, right?
Yeah. It's interesting to me that by having a lot of options in your drum set, you'd think, oh, I could do whatever I want, this feeling of freedom. But you got the feeling of freedom from stripping down to just
the space,
pick, snare. Yeah, from space.
The space.
And that to me is like, you're actually restricting what you can do in a sense.
Yeah.
But you're feeling more freedom.
Because if you've got a splash cymbal set up, you're going to want to hit it.
Too many options isn't always the best thing.
It's not always the best thing.
Right?
No.
I'm not sure if freedom is as many choices of ice cream as you want.
Yeah, maybe not.
Right?
Maybe not.
I think there seems to be something else that feeling of freedom is different than just unlimited options.
It's
right?
For me, it's a lightness, I think. Sitting there in that sparse setup just feels really light, and it feels really clean. And for me, that's a great feeling. And it's fun because I've sat behind giant drum kits recently, in the past 4 or 5 years. I remember playing a festival in Germany with Sarah, and the stage was backlined, and I think we were headlining this one night. Beautiful. I think it was in the city of Apolda, Germany. It was outdoors right in the town square. Now in Canada, outdoors in the town square doesn't mean much. In Germany, there's 1,000-year-old buildings and it's cobblestone, and it's like stunning, right? And so, we're getting ready to go up for our set. The kit was like this massive Tama, 2 up top, 2 on the side. So it's like, no, let's strip this, man. Let's just pull this. But it's funny when you sit behind a kit like that, and just the weight of it is oppressive to me. And I laugh my head off. It's like, wow, there's a lot going on here, So
like you can feel it. It just kind of closes in on you a little bit.
It just feels heavy. It just feels like, oh, there's way too much here. It hurts me. It hurts like there's too much. There's too much. I can't anymore, Whereas some people would sit down behind my 3-piece kit and be like, what on earth am I supposed to do with this?
Right.
Right.
That same feeling. I can't do this. So, right. Always more cowbell.
I can't. This is wrong. Where I just find it really, really cool myself.
Yeah.
And I play a lot of stages where that's all you got room for. So
there's a benefit to that. There's a benefit to being flexible to fit in that little spot, because oftentimes that's what you got.
Mm-hmm. But I love that feeling. That's a great feeling. I would do that exclusively from now on if I had the option, of just the 3-piece kit.
Yeah.
Bam. But the reality is I get hired by people to play music that has more drums in it than that. And if I want to replicate that music, I got to have the gear with me. So
Right.
That's okay. I don't mind. I never go further than adding a rack tom. That's it. That's as far as I go.
So for the touring, I'm sure you got a lot of road stories and different experiences. You went off with Sarah Smith. It was you, Sarah. Who else was in that?
There's been a few. There have been a few different entities, a few different lineups. The original Europe touring act was me. Well, begin at the top. It was Sarah, Ken Ross on bass. Denny Goche was the guitar player, the lead player, and I was on drums. And
all-star lineup
of sorts, yeah. And so we did that 3 times. We went to Europe and toured that way. The Ken and Sarah and me trio toured around quite a bit in North America with different players coming in and out at times. And then the last time I went to Europe with Sarah was 2021, which was really heavy because it was still in the midst of the pandemic, and that was just a whole other thing. But it was Sarah and myself and Kay Howell. I don't know if you know Kay or not.
I don't.
Kay Howell is maybe the most gifted musician the most naturally gifted musician I've ever played with. Some people are just like music. It's like she's a keyboard player. She can play anything, and she has perfect pitch, and stuff just comes out of her. Like, it doesn't matter. It just comes out of her. She's like just a conduit. Her fingers are just magic, man. So Kay came with us. We went a little bit stripped down as a 3-piece, and Kay played her keytar.
Oh, wow.
And so she was playing bass guitar on the keytar. So she had like a bass patch. So a lot of the songs she played bass on the keytar, and then some she played it as a traditional keyboard. And that was the last Euro group that I went to Sarah with. And then there's been other people in and out along the way, depending on where we were and what we were doing. And those are experiences I never expected to have in my life, especially during the 10 dark years when I wasn't playing drums at all. You know, if you had told me, by the way, in 15 years, this is what you're going to be doing.
Could never guess.
Like, what? How's that even possible? And it's really funny because in the early 2000s, when I started taking drum lessons for the first time, my teacher was Dale Ann Brendan, who is still the finest drummer I know. And Dale Ann had been in a band called Popjoy with Sarah. And so they had toured, around playing, and they had done some recording. And so one of the songs that Dale and I worked on was called Do I by Popjoy. And she had written and recorded the drum track for that. So who better to teach it? And Sarah was the singer. And so that was my introduction to Sarah. And then you fast forward 15 years, I'm playing with Sarah and we're touring around together. Just weird how stuff all weaves together, man. It's funny. It is.
And you can never guess at the time, right? Like it's so hard to see it going forward. Like you can't see. It's like headlights, right? You're driving with headlights and you can only see to the front of the headlights. And but then you look back and you realize how far you've come and how this turn leaned into that one and stopping here opened this up. And it's such an interesting way that life, like you say, weaves together. And so that hiatus, the weird thing to me that's striking me right now is that feeling of sometimes not being on the path, being the path, right? Of like that hiatus of like, oh, I'm off the game, or I'm not where I'm supposed to be. But sometimes it's like that's part of the story too, right?
Well, sometimes you have to go through that to realize where you should be, right?
Yeah.
Like the circumstances had to line up the way they did for me to wind up where I did. When I sold my kit and stuff, I thought like the drumming was not, I had no plans for drumming. I had no plans for music. I never saw myself as being a performer or a player or anything like that. It was just a hobby. And it was not deliberate that I wound up kind of doing that for a while. It was just the result of circumstance and choices. I did not set out for that. Part of me laments that I didn't take drum lessons in high school and stick with it through my 20s and try to push it and try to do that. But the truth is, I wasn't ready to do that then.
Right.
My confidence needed to grow quite a lot. There was a lot I had to learn about life and about me, and the timing, it's difficult at times, but you have to learn to trust it. And it's fun for a drummer to be saying, trust the time.
Again, the irony, right? Yeah, just trust the time.
Trust the time.
Yeah, the timing of things. Like, so what you're saying is trusting in the timing of how things unfold. Yeah. And have faith that it's carrying you to where you need to be. So
the spiritual text to which I most often refer is the Tao Te Ching, all right? Yeah. I don't want to get too nuts here.
Let's get nuts. I'm down. There's that too.
There's a verse in the Tao Te Ching that says, have faith in the way things are. Right? Taoism is kind of in the Buddhist tradition, which is about releasing your attachments, right? So have faith in the way things are. That's not always easy to do because sometimes the way things are is really, really bad, really, really terrible. You know? But if you can, then you release your attachment to a thing needing to be anything more than what it is. Or you if I had learned as a writer to have faith in the way things are, then things may have gone a lot differently. I didn't.
Right.
I had faith, not even faith. I had attachment to the way I wanted things to be, right? One of the reasons that drumming worked is that I had no attachments to the way I wanted things to be. I wasn't looking for it at all.
Right.
I just followed a nudge. But then in the process of working with people and touring and then getting the notion in my head that maybe I could do this, then I started developing the attachments. Attachments to artists, attachments to whatever recognition I felt that I needed, whatever. Like the new attachments came, and then I had to go through this whole process of untangling myself from that. That was the great gift of the pandemic to me, by the way.
Interesting, is unraveling the attachments.
Yeah, because I've not been shy about this. I had a more or less a complete anxiety breakdown during the pandemic.
Right, okay.
The summer of 2020, you'll find a large gap in my podcast production in 2020.
Right.
Where I shut myself off from the world. I dropped social media. I stopped making the podcast, and I was so overwhelmed by anxiety that I just couldn't really function.
Right. Okay.
And the pandemic was a scary time.
Yeah,
For those
for
of us
sure.
who are sensitive, some of us popped, and I popped. And so one of the things I had to learn to do was have faith in the way things are, right? Like I had to release these attachments that I had to, music was gone. Everything was gone.
Mm-hmm.
Sarah
Yeah.
moved away. Like whatever
Especially
I
for
was
you,
doing, it fell apart, right? And so I had to release my attachments to these things, and then I had to let go of even being somebody.
Mm,
I had to let go of being whatever the avatar I have of me
yeah.
is, whatever the perception of me is, and what I'm supposed to do and what I want to do and whatever. I had to let go of all those attachments. I had to let go of the ego attachments. One of the reasons I quit social media is because I don't want to be seen to be wanting to be seen.
Right.
You
Right.
can follow the layers on that.
Is that another attachment?
Well, it's weird because you can go all the way the other
Yeah.
way to becoming attached to being unattached.
Oh, attached to emptiness, right?
You can be attached to wanting to be seen to be unattached,
Yeah.
which is an attachment. So
It's so slippery. It's
you can
such a
go and
slippery
you,
thing,
like you
right?
can turn yourself inside out pretty hard on here.
Yeah,
but,
yeah.
I don't know how we got to this, but I had to let go of a lot of this stuff, and I had to let go of my own ego stuff, which was pretty intense and has underlined even feeling not good enough is an ego thing in a weird
Right.
way. So one of the reasons that I'm beginning to come to grips with myself as a player is as a product of releasing some of this ego stuff and just being okay with who I am, what I do, the way things are.
Right.
I forget what the question was that got us to that. The touring thing.
I'm loving this because you don't strike me as someone who has, what people consider an ego, right? This idea of what an ego is a bit complicated, and people can often think it's like an arrogance or a cockiness,
right?
Or
not what
something
I'm
like
talking
that, right?
about.
And it's a totally different thing when you start looking into more of the spiritual side and the ego and the psychology of it. It's so slippery, and it's a different thing.
It is.
So for you, in that process of that unraveling and letting go of attachments and kind of that self-analysis or self-reflection state that you were in, what did that process look like for you? Like, was it reading a lot of books? Was it, going for a lot of walks? Like, what kind of helped you during that?
So there are different phases of this process. I had been undertaking a spiritual path before that. This makes me sound way more spiritual than I actually am, by the way, but here's how I see it. So if you go back and look at my blog posts from 2017 through 2019, it's all spiritual / personal development stuff, because even as far back as that, I was in the throes of attachment. I was in the throes of attachment to artists, opportunities. I'm not getting this opportunity that I deserved, or I'm not being recognized in this way that I feel as though I should be. And I'm busting my ass for people and I'm not being rewarded for it. When I'm talking about ego, this is what I'm talking about. All right. Doing stuff from the motivation of being in some way gratified and recognized. Right. I'm not talking about arrogance. I'm talking about needing my tires pumped by people. Right. And, so that hurts. All suffering is attachment. That's what the Buddha said.
Right.
I was feeling it. All right.
Yeah.
And so I began to really explore this more. Like, why am I feeling this stuff? What do I do about it? Right. So
2 great questions.
So, yeah, right. So like I'm just old enough now to begin to really explore some of these topics.
Right. Okay.
Other people get there faster than me. I'm a late bloomer, right? So pre-pandemic, I'm going through this process of recognizing how attached I am to things and how much that hurts and it sucks. And that leads you into kind of Eastern philosophies and whatever. And so I was exploring stuff like the Tao and like Hindu stuff and Buddha stuff and whatever. The stuff you go to when you reach an age where you realize you need something, right?
Yeah. Ram Dass and
Yeah. So we're going to get to Ram Dass.
yeah.
And there's a cat who I follow called Geoff Thompson. He's an English guy. And go look up Geoff Thompson. His story is utterly fascinating. I can give you the Coles notes.
Sure, yeah, for sure.
He was sexually abused as a 10-year-old by a martial arts teacher who was a god to him.
Mm-hmm.
Developed an intense fear of the world and anger towards the world, which became debilitating and depressing. And then eventually he became so fed up with these feelings of depression and anxiety and fear that he decided to confront them. And he built what he called the fear pyramid with his kind of the softest fear on the bottom, which was a fear of spiders. And then a pyramid all the way to the top, which was a fear of violent confrontation. A lot of us have that fear.
Right. So very physical to kind of more of a tied into kind of trauma.
I guess so, yeah. And so he set about facing each of those fears. And then he reached the top, which was violent confrontation. So, I mean, he was by that point in time a black belt and whatever. And so he took a job as a bouncer in Coventry, which at the time was one of the most violent places in Europe. And then he spent the next 10 years fighting monsters and becoming a monster in the process.
Interesting.
So he became a thoroughly violent human being, angry, obsessive, was in thousands of fights, kicked the teeth out of people's heads, a bad guy, right? Well-intentioned, right? But just executing that and releasing that energy in all the worst ways.
Right.
Long story short, Geoff Thompson had a couple of epiphanies, and he had always dreamed of being a writer, and he became one, published an autobiography. He's now a BAFTA-winning screenwriter. He's written like 50 or 60 books. He's become a spiritual teacher, a complete non-violence. And so, like I had been studying a bit of martial arts myself, and so I was introduced, very low level, by the way, introduced to Geoff Thompson through that. And I had done a lot of reading his books because he was espousing a tangible and practical spirituality.
Right.
Something you could get behind.
Yeah.
All right. So with credibility, right?
And like grounded.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Like you may run across a lot of spiritual teachers who don't necessarily feel credible to you.
For sure.
This guy was pretty street, and he's saying to me, this is the way through my experience. And so I had begun to follow some of the trails some of the breadcrumbs that he was leaving, which was to Hindu texts, to the Tao,
right,
whatever. And so I began to absorb a lot of that. And so, again, I've lost what the original train was. So come 2017, I begin to write about some of this stuff myself because I'm getting opportunities in music, and I'm recognizing that what a simple act of courage can deliver to you. And I mean, I'm the person who has always been afraid. All right.
Right.
I didn't play out because I was afraid. There have been opportunities that I have not taken because I was afraid. I've written about those. I've talked about them. I began to recognize this, and I began to see that putting yourself out there, taking a simple step, opens up these doors. And so I started to write about it. You know, Geoff Thompson said that when I find the truth, I will share it with everybody. All right. He was talking about existential stuff. He was talking about violence. It's like when I figure out what works, I will tell everyone because nobody will tell me. You know, I read books and they don't answer my questions. I had kind of a similar thoughts. Like, I'm going to begin to start writing about some of this stuff.
Yeah.
Because I think it works. And so 2017, 2018, 2019, you see me already contemplating some of these spiritual ideas and beginning to write about them and going in that direction as I was learning my own lessons. And I had a lot of them to learn, right?
As we all do.
But then the phase of the pandemic came where I utterly was shattered, and I collapsed inside, and I just sat in extraordinary amounts of anxiety for months and months and months and months. It was a complete collapse. That's where Ram Dass comes in.
Right.
All right. And it was not so much Ram Dass's lessons. It was that, but it was, at times, it was desperate enough for me that it was merely his voice. There is power in people's words and power
100%.
in their voice and in their energy. And so, I mean, there were times when I would just busy myself with something to be occupied as an antidote to this anxiety, and just listen to Ram Dass's lectures and podcasts. And through the worst of it, that was the voice that kept me there. You know? And I mean, there's so many stories I can tell. I know we've already been talking for like an hour, but
no, honestly, this is great. I have resonated a lot with Ram Dass as well, so I've kind of gone down that road as well. Same thing. There's something about the energy, and there's something about his story that just fascinates me. And again, yeah, I definitely think there's an energy that you can get from someone. There's what they're saying, and it's also how they're saying it.
Yeah.
And what he talks about always, like for me, I find, like for you have different, what was his name? Thompson?
Geoff Thompson.
Geoff Thompson. So you have Geoff Thompson, and then you have, Ram Dass, like having multiple teachers to kind of come in, and I think they all play a place. And I think maybe we'll start to segue towards mentors in this, because I think in a way they're kind of like, teachers in your life where you run into, different mentors, like the hero's journey, Campbell, what's his name? Joseph Campbell in the hero's journey. You run into these people who help you along the way, and Ram Dass was a big one for me. So,
me too.
When you start speaking about the Tao Te Ching and Ram Dass, like, like I start to salivate inside, because that's, I'm like, yes, we're talking about this, because it's such a powerful thing.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. When the student is ready, the teacher will appear. So,
yeah. So
I needed one at the time.
Right. And there it is. He kind of slides in. And so there's this crippling anxiety, and there's this kind of existential part, and there's a returning. Had you been into any of this before? Like, had you had any sort of brushes with any sort of Eastern or personal development stuff before?
Personal development for sure. And that goes all the way back to the early days of writing, like reading instructional books about writing, and then about creativity.
Yeah.
Certainly when I was reaching points of struggle. Again, one of the great ways to avoid doing the work is to read other people's advice on how to do the work.
Yeah.
So
yeah, guilty.
Right. So I took full advantage of that.
Yeah.
I mean, I grew up in the Christian world. I grew up in the evangelical Christian world.
Yeah.
So I'm hardwired to a certain type of spirituality, which in the end did not turn out to be that.
Right.
That's not my method. That's not my vehicle. But it did create in me a certain openness to esoteric stuff, I guess.
Right.
Say that?
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, this has always been there. And then the personal development thing, I mean, one of the things that happened was I left school thinking I was going to be a teacher, and then not being a teacher, and then sort of fumbling around after that into jobs and whatever, and being unhappy. And so you begin to consult resources that are about, what am I supposed to do? What do I actually want? Which I still don't have the answer to that, by the way. But so I began.
Well, if you figure it out, let me know, because I'm working on the same thing here.
Yeah. So for a long, long time, I've been going into material about how to sort yourself out. So that's part of the self-help world. But people make a really good point. So you can become a self-help junkie, for starters, and you can like read this book without absorbing one word of it, and push it away to get to the next book and read that one and this one and that one. It's like, it's the same thing. It's just avoiding the real questions, right?
Yeah. It's
So
like a different version of like consumption, right?
It
like,
is, yeah. And distraction.
Yeah. So some people, it's like, they'll collect stuff.
Right.
Information can be like that sometimes, right? Where I'm just going to collect a bunch of knowledge and facts and everything. And it makes you feel like, I know something, I changed, but it begs the question, like, what are you doing? What do you do, and what are you doing?
Yeah. Right.
Yeah,
of course it does. Yeah. So I mean, I rode that train for a while. I don't so much read self-help anymore. I still listen to a lot of lectures though. I'm really interested in, I grew up listening to preachers, so I think it's just part of my wiring to be attracted to, I like listening to intelligent, articulate people talk about things that matter to them, right?
Yeah.
One of the reasons I like solo podcasts. One of the reasons I like Ram Dass. He's a fabulous speaker, right?
He is
really, really clever and really witty. And then, it's just part of my makeup. So I've always, not always, but for a long, long time, I've been sort of hammering around this question of what do I want? What do I want to do? And what am I supposed to do? And that's all self-help. But at a certain point, you have to sort of let go of the self-help and actually begin to work with the material, I guess, instead of just getting more material, right? Because it feels like you're doing something when you're actually not.
Right? There's reading a book is not doing the thing.
No.
Right? I mean, you can read a million books on drumming, but it doesn't make you a good drummer.
No,
and I think that's often the case with spirituality and spiritual books. You can get into a bit of spiritual bypassing, right? And just
that's a good term, yeah.
Stoicism and stuff like that can sometimes lead into just I just ignore all my feelings. I ignore what's going on. I ignore reality.
Right. Oh yeah.
Right, and you kind of just jump up above it and you pretend like it doesn't really matter. But I feel like that's more like maybe detachment than non-attachment.
Those are two different things. You're right.
Yeah, it seems like.
Yeah. I mean, you're still supposed to feel things. It's what you do with those feelings, I think, that matters.
Right.
How you channel that energy.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I think there's something there too, and I think you even talked about it in the drumming, right? Of like, you like the small kit. You like this certain thing, but for someone else, it might be different.
Yeah.
So I think, embracing the parts of you that, normally you might reject, of like anger, like maybe the anger has something to say, right? Like, what is it trying to say?
It always has something to say.
Yeah. Well, of course, anger always has something to say, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think, reflecting on that. So with Ram Dass, and these other, you said you like lectures, and you kind of came from a Christian background. It was Christianity. At what point did that start to shift? If you're comfortable with talking about it, I mean.
Well, no, it's not that I'm not comfortable. It's like, what's the answer? I towed the party line pretty good through most of my teenage years, and then I had some reservations. I'm suspicious of certainty.
Yes,
I'm not going to articulate.
We all should be.
I'm not going to articulate this very well, but there were certain things that didn't seem to add up for me.
Right.
In the story.
Yeah.
But you're not encouraged to contemplate that. Right? In fact, you're told that it's a sin to contemplate that. So sin has some pretty heavy consequences in Christianity, I will say.
Yeah.
So I, in a certain sense, I always had kind of slight reservations. There's some real beauty in that faith, as there's beauty in all faiths. But some of it just didn't quite add up for me. But then I went off to university, secular university, started studying philosophy, started studying history, started having my eyes open to some different ideas about the world, which reflected on how I approached the world.
Right.
Which was in some ways kind of a judgmental way. things just didn't quite. I learned a lot that I didn't know before about other religions, other ways of thinking, other philosophies, and I had to reckon with myself at that point in time. It's like, well, is what you believe actually true?
Right.
Or what you were told actually true?
Right.
And if other people don't believe it, why is that? And what are you learning from way smarter people than you that you hadn't considered before, right? So the seeds started being planted there about looking elsewhere, I guess.
Like a seeking.
A little bit, yeah. Then something happened that changed everything, which was I went with my wife and I lived for a year in Japan.
Oh, okay.
Where Christianity is not the thing.
Right.
And I mean, I don't want to be controversial here or anything, but I was looking around. There had been some stuff maybe in my family, some stuff I had seen around the church. Church is weird, can be a weird little universe. And a lot of weird stuff can happen in it. I'd seen some weird stuff that I didn't like. And then I was in Japan. And things are Buddhist, things are Shinto. There was a kind of reverence in Japan that I hadn't experienced elsewhere. It was very peaceful. And it was not caught up so much in dogma. It was not so much caught up in rules. I mean, Japanese society has its own sort of cultural rules. That's a different thing.
Yeah.
But in terms of spirituality, it seemed very tied to nature. It seemed very personal, seemed very individual. It didn't seem too keen to condemn anybody for all of eternity. Like there was just a certain gentleness and peacefulness in what I understood to be the spiritual traditions. All right. I liked that.
Yeah.
It felt really nice. And people there were absolutely lovely to my wife and me. And I realized that the faith I grew up in, this is just my interpretation. I realized that the faith I grew up in would condemn these people to eternal damnation for all eternity.
Right.
Because they did not have a Christian faith. And I had seen some stuff in my church from people who I guess were going to go to heaven forever.
Right.
That did not gel with this note. Like, it just didn't add up to me anymore. Like, why should these people be condemned because they're wonderful? And why should these other people, I'm really trying hard not to present myself as judgmental. It wasn't adding up to me.
Yeah.
That there are people who are going to be condemned forever to hell. And they're lovely. Like it didn't make sense to me.
Yeah.
So for me, once some of the foundations began to crack, the thing toppled like a house of cards.
Right.
It just fell into dust. It's like, this does not add up to me. I've had my inklings for a long time. And so it kind of came apart for me at that point. And then I spent a lot of really edgy years feeling guilty and frightened about that.
Right.
And then trying to come up with this spiritual sense of things that works. You know, there's stuff in Christianity that I think makes a lot of spiritual sense if you interpret it somewhat differently.
For sure.
This notion of Christ consciousness, this notion of dying to your egoic self and rising again with a spiritual perspective. That is what's happened to me in my life.
Right.
You know? And a lot of the principles of Christianity about loving your neighbor and, you know, helping people and being of service to people, I can 100% get behind. Some of the dogma, some of the certainty doesn't quite work for me. And so that's one of the reasons I began to find my way towards spiritual traditions that just felt more gentle to me.
Right.
And those are the Eastern ones.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There
But
is
go ahead.
There is a feeling of, you know, gentleness and compassion with the Zen and kind of Buddhism and Eastern philosophies, but there can be some hardness too, right? And being out in the rain for days straight and kind of like deep hard meditation, which I think sometimes, and this is just from maybe my naive spot too, where I think maybe some of that may miss the point too, right? Like, you hear the Buddha and the middle way, right? Like, he did that. He went to the extremes. He tried this and then tried this and then tried this. And, and then finally he gave up on all of that. And it's like, okay, I'm going to sit here until I figure this out. I'm not going to move until I figure out what the hell's going on here, what I'm supposed to do, what's going on.
Right.
And that's the story, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I'm not qualified to say. I can only speak from my own experience,
I'm definitely not qualified, so take it with a grain of salt.
No, I wouldn't pretend that I am. I just can only speak from my own experience, which is that I interact better on a spiritual level with some of those traditions. And so, I mean, Ram Dass comes from a Hindu perspective, as you like to say. And there's just a certain quality in his way of speaking and what he talks about that really appealed to me. And at a time when I desperately needed that, there he was,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. A similar story for me that he came about at an interesting time, right? Again, like you said, when the student's ready, the teacher appears, and right. he was very helpful for a lot of things. I think there are limitations that having multiple teachers can really help to kind of shape and fill things out. Sure. And I think at certain times, maybe certain teachers can really come in handy, and then maybe at another time you move on to someone else, and it's important. And so I'm wondering, that move away from that, like, did that affect some of like your friends and family relationships? Did that start to kind of
probably.
Yeah, right. Because I would imagine, like, I mean, I didn't grow up forced to go to church, and I guess we're going deep first episode, so I mean, here we are. I didn't grow up having to go to church, right? I didn't have a lot of the negative experiences that that a lot of other people have had going through that and been traumatized by certain things. So I didn't have a strong feeling either way. I've always been curious, and always known that I don't know.
Right.
So that's generally led me well. I've always kind of had this thing like I don't know. There might be something there. I don't know. And like you say, the certainty.
Yeah, this is the thing. Like, that humility, I think, is very helpful.
Yeah.
Whereas you occasionally encounter a certain type of arrogance that says, I know the answer. I know how it is. And you just don't. I mean, you can have a faith in things, I guess, but I think humility is really, really important, which is why I'm reluctant to say some of the things I'm even saying right now, because I don't want to come off like I know.
No,
I want to come off like I think I do, because I don't.
I think what I'm getting you from you is that we all don't know, right? I think everyone just kind of got their best guess, and I think it's right to be wary of people who say that they know. Yeah. And well, the funny thing was Ram Dass, right? In his story, he was looking for someone who knew. I don't know if you've listened to the whole journey through India.
Oh yeah.
So it's like, he goes searching for someone who knew, and he's in Harvard.
But he was not looking for Maharaji. That's the
no.
Right?
Yeah, and that story's fascinating.
Life led him to who would become his guru. Yeah. I mean, because he had spent so much time in psychedelics trying to know that way, right?
Right.
Having certain portals opened up.
Yeah.
Like, I can do LSD and then I can access this plane of consciousness. And so he brings that to Maharaji, and Maharaji says, yeah, you can access it, but you can't stay there.
Right.
But if you meditate and you adopt these practices, you can stay there. Right? Really interesting. I mean, that's getting way above my pay grade, But I mean, Ram Dass's story is absolutely fascinating.
Yeah. It's one that's intrigued me for a long time, because it's just, yeah, that story of you think you know how the world works, and then something happens, you have some sort of experience or something, and that breaks it.
Right.
It breaks the frame of how you saw the world.
Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden you're left with what do I do, right? And he was left with, I'm home, right? That feeling of, oh, I'm home. Not, this is unfamiliar, I don't understand this. This is like, oh, I belong. I like, there's something, you know?
Yeah.
And I do think it's fascinating to, you know, he quotes Gandhi sometimes of, you know, like, my life is my message, right? And I think that for him was like, he said a lot, but hearing his story, and I think this starts to tie back into podcasting, if I can kind of route this in.
Oh,
right?
This is going to be fun. Okay, go for it.
Of the storytelling, right? I mean, hearing his story, regardless of content of what he says, just his actual life, there's something that's inspiring. There's something that resonates. And I think in a similar way, offering on a podcast, you know, Phoenix Fire, a platform to tell your story.
Right.
There's something both healing for, I think, the person. He seemed like he didn't tell his story a lot.
Yeah. I mean, he wasn't expecting to tell me all the stuff that he told me either.
Well, I wasn't expecting to go into what we're talking about either, but here we are, right?
But here we are. Yeah, that's right.
And I think there's something truly healing for the person to tell their story, right? Everyone wants to be heard. They want to say their story, but also to hear people's stories.
It's important.
Stories are important.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, and yeah, so as far as what time we got? So you don't have any heart out?
I don't have a heart out. No.
All right. So I guess in that case, we're back at the podcast for now. What do you feel has changed most from the beginning to kind of where you are now?
The most obvious thing is the format. Going from guest episodes to solo episodes is a complete sea change, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, you know, it is what it is. It's like it's what I was inclined to do. And as I said, I'm beginning to introduce more guests again now, just here and there, just to give my audience a different voice to hear, you know. And I think my delivery has changed dramatically, which can only happen with practice, right? There was, when I kind of dedicated myself to solo episodes, I delivered those in the way I delivered them. And then I would listen back to them and I'd be like, this needs more energy. It's weird. Some people, like, my favorite podcast on earth probably is the Blind Boy podcast.
Right,
I don't know if you've listened to that.
No. Blind
Boy is 90% solo episodes. He is Irish, from Limerick, Ireland. And his podcast is largely concerned with Irish folklore and traditions and really arcane histories. And he does a lot of mental health stuff too. But his podcast is utterly fascinating in that he'll do an episode about pineapples and the history of pineapples. And he'll make it the most profound episode you've ever heard. And he'll tie it into social justice, and he'll tie it in, like, it's extraordinary what he'll do with what seems to be a really arcane topic. All that to say, he speaks in a very pleasant, to us, Irish accent, right? And his delivery is very measured, very paced, very gentle, right? It's very soothing. And it works perfectly for him, right? And so somewhere along the way, I was listening to my own episodes and it was like, they need more oomph. They need more. They're not engaging enough. And it's my delivery that's the problem. And so I intentionally began to speak with more energy and enthusiasm, which over the course of, I don't know, 50, 75 episodes, developed into this persona that you hear on my podcast, which is not my real speaking voice.
Right.
I'm not shy about saying that.
Yeah.
Like, my wife will hear me editing, and she'll just kind of look at me and shake her head like, "That's not you."
Right.
Like, I don't know who that voice is, but it's not you. So I don't know. This weird persona has come into the podcast that wasn't there before. So there's been a couple practical things, I guess.
Right.
Just the format and the way I deliver it has changed. And the only way that could happen is for me to do 147 episodes, which is where we sit at right now.
140. Wow.
It's purely an evolution.
Yeah.
And you can't do the evolution unless you start somewhere, right?
It has to start somewhere. Put yourself out there, do the thing.
And then let you become, the thing. So I don't know where the thing's going.
Mm-hmm.
I still feel like I don't even know what it is. And I don't know if I have a small but dedicated group of listeners, which is nice. And I hope they get something from it. And
well, I mean, you got one more in me because I've been enjoying. I think I've been kind of binging that for the past few days, and I'm loving it. So you got me hooked.
All right. Well, have you been mostly listening to the interviews?
Yeah. So for me, I haven't listened to too many of the solo episodes. Because for me, I really like dialogue. Like I love, that between people and what they share and something kind of comes alive between people.
Yeah.
And then you start to kind of share that. I haven't listened to too many of the solo ones yet.
I have an episode with a comedian from LA called Nikki Bond. I don't know if you listened to Nikki's episode.
No, not yet.
Apart from Phoenix Fire, it's in terms of the interviews, at least it's top 3 or 4 for me. So if you're looking for one, listen to the Nikki Bond episode.
Nikki Bond.
Which turned out to be a fascinating conversation about her trying to make it as a comedian in LA. And the parallels between the comedy world and the music world and really, really fascinating. And there've been some really good interviews, and I can't really take credit for that. Like, it depends on who you're talking to.
Right.
I've done interviews in the past with people who just wouldn't open up, and they became very stilted and difficult.
Right.
And then you encounter somebody like Nikki or my friend Jackie Neville of the Balconies, who gave me 2 fabulous interview episodes.
That was one that's on the to watch list. I wrote down a few that were intriguing that I have a list. So.
Yeah, the first one I did with Jackie, for musicians, is really one to listen to because without extending this too far, she was in a band called the Balconies. It's one of my favorite bands of all time. And when I interviewed her the first time, an interview 5 years in the chasing, by the way, the Balconies were about a year after they had broken up. And so this was Jackie reflecting on the end of this band that she dedicated her life to. And what do you do when it all falls apart? How do you rebuild your life when this thing that you've been so dedicated to falls apart? And for any sort of creative, but particularly for musicians, that's a fascinating one. And then earlier this year, Jackie came back to talk about her new life and what she does now. And she just released a solo album. It's like coming back into music after having this devastating experience, So
you got both bookends of that.
Yeah, kind of.
Yeah.
Right? So it's like one of the things I really enjoy about doing the interview episodes is just some of the cool people you get to meet along the way.
Yeah.
And then just what you said, the stories that they tell, the wisdom that people have and the experience that they have there's a lot you can learn, and there's a lot of inspiration to be drawn from them, And so it's like I applaud people like you who are just providing another platform for people to share those stories. Like, it's a really important service. There are a lot of podcasts out there that, again, I don't want to be judgy, but they seem to just be celebrities congratulating each other.
Right. Yeah.
And they can be really entertaining and whatever, and they can be fun, but it's like podcasts like I think what you have in mind, some of the others that I've listened to, where it's like people are coming in and really sharing their real story. There's enormous value in that for people.
Definitely.
That you may not even ever know about. This Geoff Thompson himself talks about some of the material he's put out there, some of the books that he's put out there, that some kid at 4 a.m, maybe struggling with suicidal thoughts, and happen upon one of his lectures or an interview that he's done or a book that he's written that saves that kid's life.
Right.
And this is what the power of people's stories, it's the power that it has.
Yes, definitely.
And so I sometimes feel a responsibility to just give people the chance to share those stories too, as you are doing. And so good for you. That's a service, and it's important.
Well, I appreciate that, because I think that touches on what my hope for this could be, right? What it could be is a platform to, I don't want to make it about me, what I believe, what I think, what I have to say. I mean, I'm sure there's going to be some of that falls in. I'm sure I'll do some different episodes with, maybe some books and different stuff that I'm interested in. But I think you said that really, really well. It's about the people and the platform and the stories that you can get. So I know in your early episodes, I don't know if you do it lately, I know you do the 3 questions.
The 3 questions.
So ironically enough,
you're going to do that, aren't you?
I'm going to throw it back to you. So I'm going to ask you, first of all, what's it like to be, do you get interviewed often?
Very occasionally.
Right. Okay.
I used to get interviewed more when I was in Hearts.
Right.
When I was in the band, people wanted to talk about the band. And I was the publicist for the band, so it was my job to get us interviewed.
Right.
But as a podcaster, not a lot. Once in a while. And it's weird, by the way.
Yeah. Well, and it's also like, it's like drumming in front of a drummer that you respect, right? Interviewing someone who interviews. So there's the hope of like, oh well, hopefully it looked good in their eyes as well.
Oh, you've done great. Look, the whole key for me is for it to be a conversation. Like my original tagline on the podcast was "Conversations with Cool People."
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah,
and I do not use the word interview if I'm conscious.
Right.
Conversations.
Right, yeah.
So you have found a way to make this conversational, but also to ask the questions I think you wanted to ask. But you've also ridden along with me on tangents that neither of us were expecting. And that's also a skill, right?
Oh,
because you can come into an interview with a list of 20 questions and completely miss the interview, forcing it back to those 20 questions instead of letting it go this way and then following where that leads. Right. So you're savvy enough to have done that, and that's a skill that you've already got, right?
Oh, I appreciate that.
So you're flying already.
Awesome. That's a huge compliment coming from you. I think
it's true.
I think that following that flow, I think that ties into so much what we've said today.
Ultimately,
kind of going with those little nudges, and sometimes for me, I try and follow what has the most energy, right?
Yeah.
What's kind of, it seems sometimes there's almost something that wants to be said.
Yeah.
Right? Like even in a person, right? Maybe something wants to be expressed too, like music or writing. And I think paying attention to what wants to be attended to is a skill that, I try and work on.
But you've got to
I think this is a great way.
Right? It's like you've got to be aware that exists.
Yeah.
So that's very important.
Right. Yeah. So I've really enjoyed this. I mean, there's a part of me that's tempted to just continue on for the next 2 hours, because I think maybe we'll have to do another one if you're okay with that.
Oh, of course, absolutely.
Because I think we could go for another.
If you put this out into the world and then people come back to you like, I never want to hear that dude again, maybe we won't do another one.
I think we'll probably do 2 more. We'll probably do 2 more just to kind of face that fear, right? Because for me, you said about facing your fears and vulnerability and confidence. For this, it's a different type of vulnerability. Conversation. I always overthink conversations and walk away being like, oh, should I have said that? Right. Oh, I didn't ask that the right way, right? So the thought of my conversations forever being captured in time and being shared with the world is like super uncomfortable for me.
Yeah. I've had that happen too, by the way, lots of times. Get to the end of the thing and then you're like, oh, why didn't I ask this? I meant to ask that. it's okay. It's fine.
It's an opportunity, I think, for next time. I think there's lots of threads that we could continue following. So I'd definitely love to have you on again. But I do want to ask you the 3 questions because I think that's kind of
going to be
so,
rough, man.
what are you trying? I mean, you already touched on a lot about this, but what are you trying to improve about yourself?
Yeah. I am still working diligently at this ego stuff. I'm still learning to let go. I still want to control so many things, and learning to just trust and have faith. I mean, my pandemic ego breakdown, there's 2 sides of that coin. All right. One is surrendering your ego. The other side is having faith that the surrender will lead you to the right places. The faith part is tricky for me.
Right.
Coming from the background I come from, faith is a loaded word.
Yeah.
Right.
Definitely.
So I've had to redefine some of that. And so what I continue to work on is having faith and allowing the future to unfold. And having some sort of faith that it will unfold in the way it does, and continuing to just make my ego, it's not the arrogance, but this living for my own kind of gratification, making that smaller and allowing myself to be led in the direction I should go, which is not easy for me to do.
Right. I think that's something that would probably resonate with a lot of people, because I think a lot of us struggle with that exact same thing. So I think that was very, very well said.
It's the human condition. We have egos. The ego is not bad. It just has to be.
It's not something to be destroyed, right? I'm not a fan of those people who are like, "Oh, I got to destroy my ego." Ego dissolution. You got to befriend it, right?
Your ego is what keeps you alive. It's developing the right relationship with it.
Right, the right relationship.
Yeah.
So next question: what are you most excited for? And this was, I think, you mentioned a question you got from Anne Monez.
That was an Anne question.
Yeah. So I'm stealing your questions that you usually ask at the end of the podcast. So what are you most excited for?
What am I most excited about right now? So I guess on a practical level, we're recording this on a Sunday. On Tuesday, I'm scheduled to conduct an interview of my own for my show.
Yeah.
Which is with the fabulous Emily Dolan Davis, who is a drummer from the UK. She's been on my show before, so go listen to Emily's episode from like 4 years ago.
Yeah, I'll check that one out.
Emily's one of my favorite people on planet Earth. She is the drummer she's the house drummer for the Voice Kids UK TV show, BBC, I assume. There's a documentary on Netflix called Count Me In, which is all about drummers and drumming. Emily is featured in Count Me In.
Oh, nice.
Among other things. And she's an enormous inspiration. And I'm having a conversation with Emily on Tuesday. So
I like that little distinction.
yeah, I have to remind myself sometime. So I'm chatting with Emily on Tuesday for an episode that I will release sometime soon. So I'm excited about that. How's that?
No, that's great. How long does it generally take you? Like, do you sit on some for a while, or like how long is it generally between recording and then releasing for you?
Yeah, well, I do so few interviews anymore that I don't even know, but I release my show on Wednesday mornings. I'm chatting with Emily on Tuesday. I don't know if I'll be able to turn it around that quickly.
Yeah.
Which leaves me in this position where if I don't, then I got to have something for Wednesday. Right. So I'll be spending this evening thinking about if I have to do a solo episode recording tomorrow, what's it going to be? And so that opens up interesting questions. But I normally try and, with the interviews, I like back in the day, I try to have 2 or 3 episodes canned.
Yeah.
Just to give me a buffer.
Yeah.
But now the interviews are so rare that I kind of turn them around I try to make that the next episode if I can, but it doesn't always work. It depends on the editing. And I mean, it can be it's painstaking for me sometimes to do the editing. So it depends on how that goes. So not a very simple answer to that question.
Well, no, it's good. I mean, I think the good thing about, me right now is as I haven't started, right? So there's I could bank, quite a few here.
Well, that's what I did.
Did you? Yeah,
I banked 4 or 5 before I
Yeah.
actually released anything. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's probably what I'm maybe hoping for. But yeah, so I'm hoping to kind of make it as easy workflow as possible.
Yeah.
Hopefully not a lot of editing. So what I'm gonna hopefully do is send out the finished episode to the person if they have anything that they want to kind of cut out or anything like that. Like I want to leave it open where they're willing to go right in, but with the caveat, if there's something in there that's too much that you want to take out, like for sure, no pressure in that way, right?
Really?
I don't know. I think I'd rather leave it open with them. And maybe this isn't the greatest view, but I was kind of thinking, not having the pressure of like, I can actually say what I want to say. And I think after there might be, they might see value in sharing that. Whereas in the moment they might, I don't know, hold back from sharing because they're worried about whether it will be shared. But I don't know.
I've only ever had 1 or 2 people come back to me and say, hey, that one section, can you take this out?
Yeah.
That's pretty rare. But I mean, I don't do interviews that would be in any way controversial. I don't think so.
Right. Might be me more being like, I'm going to chop out this side for me. But I'm hoping to not do that. I want to leave it pretty open and raw and,
No, absolutely. I mean, sending it out to people might disrupt your workflow enormously.
Right. Okay.
If you're waiting on somebody to listen to that and get back to you, you might be waiting a long dang time.
Fair enough. I think that's a good point. So before I ask this last question, I would ask, do you have any advice or thoughts? I know you've kind of dropped it here and there. You've been very helpful in that, but do you have any other advice for someone starting out a podcast or a new project?
I've suspected you might ask me this.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's practical stuff along the way. It really does help to know who you're trying to reach and why. Like what it comes back to for me, at least with the podcast, is this notion of why you're doing it.
Right.
Because it's reasonably likely that at some point down the line, you're going to be neck deep in editing an episode where the sound is crap and you've got to fix it somehow, or it didn't work, or it's a bad interview or whatever, and you're not getting any downloads. And you're going to ask yourself the question, what am I doing this for? Why am I doing this?
Yeah.
I mean, as a musician, you've probably had this experience.
For sure.
Where you're looking out at a show that nobody's at. Or they're not paying
there's
attention.
been 1 or 2.
And you've stood and you've asked yourself, what am I doing? Why am I doing this? It will happen with your podcast too. It will happen with any project. It happens at a certain point in every book you're writing where you're bogged down and this is not fun anymore. It's a pain. Having a good answer at the ready to why am I doing this is useful. So that's a practical piece of advice. Otherwise, the message is the message. Good things happen when you put yourself out there. So you just got to jump in, man.
Yeah.
Whatever you're doing is not likely to be fully formed. I'm 147 episodes into my show. I still even know what it's about. So, do not let perfection hold you back. Jump in and do it. Let it evolve. Enjoy the ride along the way. I've had young musicians come to me, or at shows or whatever. Like I'm always older than everybody, and they'll begin to talk to me about what they're doing and what the hope is and where they're going. And I will often say to them, don't forget to enjoy the ride. Don't get so wrapped up in the details and the projections and what's going to be in 10 years that you don't enjoy the ride today. So, do that too. Enjoy this process wherever it leads.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. I think I don't know if I even asked the last question, but I think you knew it was coming. So I think you kind of tied in the message. I think there's been quite a few, so I really appreciate, giving me the time.
Oh, my pleasure.
and coming on here and making this easy.
I genuinely appreciate you having any interest in what I'm doing. I do appreciate that. Thank you.